To inherit a great American fortune in 1896 was to inherit a script, and the script was written by someone else. Three men in this story believed they could close that script and write their own ending. One married a Tennessee financier's daughter and lost $40 million in a single revised paragraph. One built a castle for a Broadway actress and watched her walk out with the largest separation settlement of the era. One arrived drunk at his fiancee's parlor on New Year's Day and spent the next 40 years in exile while his dynasty crumbled by cable from Paris. They thought they were choosing wives. They were choosing exits. If you want the stories the family histories were paid to forget, subscribe to Old Money Corrupts. I find the wills, the court files, and the empty pews so you can see what these fortunes actually cost the people inside them. Chapter 1. The Christmas Quarrel That Cost $40 million. On December 25, 1895, the heir to the largest fortune in America told his father he intended to marry the woman his father had forbidden. The house was 640 Fifth Avenue. The room was the second-floor library. The father was Cornelius Vanderbilt II, who had inherited the New York Central Railroad from his own father, William Henry, and doubled it again. The son was Cornelius III, 22 years old, a graduate of the Sheffield Scientific School at Yale, an engineer with more than 30 patents in his future. The fortune around them had been built in 3 generations. Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, dead since 1877, had left $105 million. William Henry had taken it past $200 million in 8 short years before his own death in 1885. Cornelius II, 52 on that Christmas day, was the steward of $72.5 million in personal capital and the controlling block of New York Central stock. Every dollar of it was destined under his existing will for the eldest son. That son was the boy standing in front of him. The woman in question was Grace Wilson. She was 24. She was the youngest of the 4 Wilson sisters, daughters of Richard Thornton Wilson, a Tennessee banker who had supplied the Confederate Army with cotton during the Civil War, and then moved his family to New York and made a second fortune in railroad finance. 2 of Grace's sisters had already married into the Gould and Astor lines. The Wilsons were called, in the columns of the day, the Marrying Wilsons. To Alice Vanderbilt, mother of Cornelius III and cousin to the Mrs. Astor herself, the family was new. The fortune was Confederate. The youngest daughter had been engaged once before to William Douglas Sloan of the Furniture Dynasty and had broken it. There were whispers of an earlier attachment to the Duke of Manchester. None of it had been proved. None of it needed to be proved. What Cornelius II said to his son that Christmas afternoon survives only in the memory of the family. The shouting was loud enough to carry through the marble hall. At some point in the hour that followed, the father suffered the first of the strokes that would kill him within 4 years. He was helped to a chair. The doctor was called. The son left the house. Whether the stroke was caused by the quarrel is a question that medicine cannot answer at a distance of more than a century. What can be answered is what the father did next. In the spring of 1896, recovering at the Newport House, he summoned his lawyers and instructed them to draft a new will. The old will had left the leading share of the fortune to Cornelius III, in line with 3 generations of Vanderbilt practice. The new will broke that line. The leading share was to pass instead to Alfred Vanderbilt, the second son, 20 years old, then in his junior year at Yale. The eldest son was to receive $1.5 million outright and the income on a trust of $7.5 million more. The reduction was almost 97% of the share he had been told all his life he would inherit. Cornelius II did not tell his son. He did not even tell his wife the full terms. The will was signed in 1896 and revised twice more, in 1897 and in August 1899, each revision tightening the language against the marriage. The document was placed in the safe of the Equitable Trust Company. It would not be opened until the father was dead. Meanwhile, the wedding date was set for August 3, 1896. The location chosen was St. Mark's Church in Islip, on the south shore of Long Island, an hour's train ride from Manhattan and a deliberate distance from every Vanderbilt landmark in the city. Grace Wilson had ordered her trousseau from Worth in Paris. Cornelius III had asked his closest friend from Yale to stand with him. Neither his mother nor his father would attend. The boy had spent 22 years inside the script. He had studied the right subjects, made the right friendships, joined the right clubs. The marriage to Grace Wilson was the first decision of his life that the script did not contain. He made it in the full knowledge of what his father had threatened. He made it anyway. What he could not yet know was the scale of the punishment waiting for him in the equitable trust safe. Chapter 2. Grace Wilson. Arrived without a Vanderbilt. Grace Wilson was the most determined of the four marrying Wilsons, and her sisters had already made New York wary. The eldest, May, had married Ogden Gould of the great New York real estate family in 1878. The second, Belle, had married Sir Michael Henry Herbert, the British ambassador to Washington, in 1888. The third, Orme, was male and a different kind of subject. The fourth, Grace, was watched with particular interest because she was the prettiest of the four and the cleverest, and because she had already made one socially advantageous attempt and missed. The Wilson family money was not old in the New York sense. Richard Thornton Wilson had been born in Habersham County, Georgia, in 1829, the son of a Tennessee farmer. He had built a tannery in Loudon, Tennessee, in the 1850s, supplied leather and cotton to the Confederate Army between 1861 and 1865, and arrived in New York in 1867 with the proceeds of those contracts converted into bonds. He invested in the Cumberland and Ohio Railroad, the Wabash, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. By the early 1890s, he was worth several $1 million in his own right. The fortune was real. It was simply not Vanderbilt money. It was not Astor money. It was not even Gould money, although the marriage to Ogden had brought the family across a line. Alice Vanderbilt's objection to Grace was social, financial, and personal in different proportions. The social objection was that the Wilsons had been Confederate, and that no Vanderbilt had married into a Confederate fortune in 2 generations. The financial objection was that Grace Wilson brought no dowry comparable to what a Vanderbilt heir was expected to attract. The personal objection was that Grace had been engaged before, and the breaking of an engagement in the 1890s was a stain that did not wash out. The earlier engagement had been to William Douglas Sloan, son of William Douglas Sloan Sr. and Emily Vanderbilt, which made him Grace's future second cousin once removed through marriage. The engagement had been announced in 1893. It had ended within the year. The reason given to the columns was that Grace had been seen too often in the company of the Duke of Manchester during a London season, and that William Sloane had withdrawn the proposal. The truth, according to letters in the Wilson family papers, was nearer the reverse. Grace had ended the engagement herself after concluding that William Sloane was not the man for her. The Manchester rumor was a cover story put about by both families to spare embarrassment. Cornelius III met Grace at a country house party in Newport in the summer of 1894. He was a year younger than she was. He had spent his Yale summers studying engineering rather than sailing, and Grace's quick conversation drew him out of his shyness in a way his mother's circle had never quite managed. By the end of that summer, they were known to be a pair. By the spring of 1895, they were engaged. They had not announced the engagement publicly. They were waiting for Cornelius III's father to give consent. The consent was refused twice. The first refusal came at Easter, 1895, and was delivered as an instruction to wait. The second refusal came in October and was firm. The Christmas Day quarrel was therefore not a sudden eruption. It was the third refusal turned into a third reply. The son had decided, by Christmas of 1895, that he would marry without consent, he told his father. The hour ended in stroke and silence. For the 8 months between Christmas and the wedding, Grace Wilson moved with the steadiness of a woman who has decided that the storm has already been chosen. She allowed the trousseau to be ordered. She corresponded with the church at Islip. She accepted with grace the absence of every Vanderbilt name from the guest list. The Wilson family was loyal to her. Her sisters Belle and May attended. Her father gave her away. The press, when it arrived in Islip on the day, photographed a small wedding of perhaps 80 guests, the men in morning coats, the women in summer hats. What the press also noted, and printed on the front page of the New York Times of August 4, 1896, was the empty Vanderbilt pew on the right side of the aisle. The pew had been reserved. It was empty when Grace walked past it on her father's arm. It remained empty during the ceremony. It remained empty during the breakfast at the Wilson house afterward. The space inside it was the public ratification of the family's refusal. Every reader of the next morning's paper understood what the empty pew meant. The Vanderbilts had said no in print without speaking a word. What no one yet knew was that the silence of the empty pew was already being matched by the silence of the rewritten will in the equitable trust safe. The first cost of the marriage had been the day itself. The larger cost was waiting for the funeral. Chapter 3. The Will That Erased. The Eldest Son. August the 3rd, 1896, was reported on the front page of every New York paper, but the family pew at the church was empty. The story ran above the fold in the Herald, the Times, the World, and the Sun. The Herald, owned and edited at long distance by James Gordon Bennett II from his Paris flat at Avenue d'Eylau, gave the wedding a sympathetic 2 columns. The Times printed Grace's trousseau in detail and described the bouquet. The World, edited by Joseph Pulitzer, paired the wedding with a society column item about the absent parents and let the reader draw the conclusion. The Sun printed a single dry paragraph and the photograph of the empty pew. What every paper missed was the legal document that had been signed 3 days earlier in the offices of Choate, Larocque, and Choate, the Vanderbilt family lawyers. The document was a codicil to the will of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, dated July 31st, 1896. The codicil expressly cited the impending marriage of the testator's eldest son to a person of whom the testator did not approve. It reduced the eldest son's outright bequest to $1 million and instructed the executors to consider the matter further before final probate. The codicil was signed, witnessed, and placed in the safe at the Equitable Trust Company on Wall Street. The same week, a draft of a final will was prepared. It would be revised twice more in the next 3 years. Cornelius II's strokes continued. In April 1899, he suffered the cerebral hemorrhage that would prove fatal. He died at his Fifth Avenue house in the early hours of September 12, 1899, age 55. The funeral at St. Bartholomew's drew the entire New York family network, the Astors, the Goulds, the Whitneys, the Mortons, and the Cuttings. The Wilson family attended also. Grace Vanderbilt sat in the second row of the family side, conspicuously included for the first time at a Vanderbilt event. Cornelius III was at her side. He did not yet know what was in the will. The will was opened at the Equitable Trust offices on the morning of September 15, 1899, in the presence of the executors, Alice Vanderbilt, Cornelius III, Alfred Vanderbilt, and the family lawyers. The reading began with the property settlements on the widow, which were generous and uncontroversial. It moved to the charitable bequests, which were on the scale expected of a Vanderbilt and totaled close to $1 million. It moved then to the children. The reader, a senior partner from Choate, Larocque, and Choate, set out the share assigned to Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt. The figure was $42.5 million in cash, stock, and real estate, plus the Fifth Avenue mansion at 640, plus the controlling block in the New York Central Railroad. The reader paused. He set out the share assigned to Cornelius Vanderbilt III. The figure was $1.5 million outright, and the income, but not the principal, of a trust of $7.5 million more. Cornelius III said nothing. Alfred Vanderbilt said nothing. Alice Vanderbilt closed her fan. The lawyer continued through the lesser bequests to the daughters Gertrude and Gladys, both substantial, both within the range expected. He concluded the reading and left the document on the table. The executors signed the receipts. The family rose. The eldest son had been reduced in a single afternoon from the leading heir of his generation to the junior. The reduction was 97% of the share he had been told all his life he would inherit. The instrument was a pen. The reason cited in the language of the codicil was the marriage of 1896. Within a fortnight, the New York World had the story and printed it. Within a month, every major paper in the United States had repeated it. The wedding of 1896 had been a society note. The probate of 1899 was a public verdict. The fortune that the city had assumed would flow to Cornelius III had been redirected by paragraph and signature to his younger brother. Alfred Vanderbilt was 23 years old. He had not yet finished Yale. He was now one of the 10 richest men in America. Alfred did not enjoy the position long, and to his credit, he did not enjoy it quietly either. In 1902, around his 25th birthday, he summoned his brother to the family lawyer's office and executed a private transfer of $6 million in stock to Cornelius III. The transfer was made on the explicit ground that the will had violated the unwritten Vanderbilt rule of primogeniture, and that the brothers, as living men, could correct what the dead father had done. The press did not learn of the transfer for some years. It did not undo the reduction. It moved Cornelius III from $1.5 million plus a trust to around $8 million plus a trust. The leading Vanderbilt fortune of the generation, the controlling block in the New York Central, remained with Alfred. For Cornelius III, the financial calculation was over. He took the $8 million, kept the engineering career, fathered 2 children with grace, served as a brigadier general in the First World War, and was decorated by the French government for his work on the trench railways. Grace Vanderbilt, against the prediction of every column that had printed the empty pew, became one of the leading hostesses of New York and London. The husband she had been told she could never have lived in comfort. The dynasty she had been told she could never join, she eventually ran. The cost remained. The wedding day was free. The probate day was not. The Vanderbilt case is the cleanest of the 3 in this documentary. The will was the weapon. The father was the wielder. The wife was the pretext. The instrument was clearly visible. In the second case, it would be slower and harder to see, because the instrument would be hidden inside a marriage that was lived out for 9 years before the court spoke. Chapter 4. Jay Gould's quietest son. Howard Gould had spent his life trying to wash the stain of his father's name out of every room he entered. The father was Jay Gould, born in 1836 in Roxbury, New York, the son of a poor farmer. The father had built, by his death from tuberculosis in 1892, a personal fortune of $72 million in railroad stock, Western Union Telegraph shares, and Manhattan Elevated Railway control. The father had also built a public reputation as the most hated man in America. He had cornered the gold market with James Fisk on Black Friday in 1869 and triggered a financial panic. He had manipulated the Erie Railway with Fisk and Daniel Drew through the 1868 stockbroker war. He had bought up the Western Union and squeezed competitors. The newspapers, including the New York Herald that James Gordon Bennett II was running at long distance from Paris, had run cartoons of Jay Gould as a vulture for 2 decades. Howard was born in 1871. The 4th of 6 children. He had 2 elder brothers, George and Edwin, an elder sister, Helen, and 2 younger siblings, Anna and Frank. The estate that Jay Gould left in 1892 was divided in roughly equal shares of around $12 million to each of the 6. Controlling stock in the Western Union, the Manhattan Elevated and the Missouri Pacific was placed in a family trust, with George Gould as the senior trustee. George was the heir presumptive in railroad terms. Helen was the family conscience and gave away large sums to charity. Anna Gould would marry the French Count Boniface de Castellane and become the most famous dollar princess of the decade. Edwin was a respectable financier. Frank was the youngest and the slightest. Howard was the quiet one, the one nobody had expected to become a scandal. The family campaign after 1892 was to remake the Gould name. George commissioned the building of Georgian Court in Lakewood, New Jersey, an enormous estate intended to signal seriousness. Helen built churches and funded the New York Public Library. Anna married into French aristocracy. The Goulds bought their way out of Jay's reputation, one entertainment at a time. Howard's contribution to the campaign was supposed to be a quiet, respectable marriage to a young woman of similar background. The young woman was not supposed to be a Broadway actress. Katherine Clemmons had been born in Lancashire, England, in 1867. She had come to America in the 1880s as a young actress. She had been brought across the Atlantic, by every account contemporary and later, by William Frederick Cody, known to the world as Buffalo Bill, the showman whose Wild West toured Europe and the United States from 1883. Whether Katherine had been Cody's mistress in those early years was widely assumed at the time, but never proved. Cody was married to Louisa Frederici and remained so. The Cody Wild West played in New York, Chicago, London, and Paris. Katherine appeared in several seasons of the show in a small role and then moved into the more legitimate Broadway theater, playing in light comedies and society dramas through the late 1880s. Howard Gould met her by his own later testimony in the 1907 separation suit. In the autumn of 1888 at a private reception in New York. He was 17, she was 21. The age difference and the social difference were both substantial. Howard fell in love with the quickness she had taught herself on stage and with the warmth she had practiced in the front of house. He proposed within a year. The Gould family refused. Jay Gould, then dying, refused. After Jay's death in 1892, George Gould refused. The refusal continued for 16 years. Howard, the quiet son, waited. In 1907, after the death of his sister Helen's first husband and after his own decision to retire from active business, Howard finally married Katherine. He was 36, she was 40. The wedding took place in a private ceremony in New York with very few Gould relatives present. George Gould was not there. Anna Gould, by now divorced from the Count de Castellane and in the middle of her second marriage to the Prince de Ségon, sent congratulations but did not attend. Helen Gould, the family conscience, sent flowers and a letter of welcome to Katherine that the Gould archives still hold and which Katherine kept until her death 30 years later. The marriage was Howard's first independent act. It came late. It came after a lifetime of waiting. It came with the implicit understanding that the rest of the family had reluctantly accepted it because Howard was not the senior trustee, was not the public face of the Gould name, and could be allowed his eccentricity if he stayed out of the limelight. Howard's interpretation of staying out of the limelight was to spend the next 18 months building Katherine the largest private house on the Long Island Gold Coast. The interpretation, with hindsight, was an error. The family had wanted him quiet. Castle Gould was not quiet. The first sign that something was wrong came not in the construction. It came in Katherine's reaction the first time she walked through the front door. Chapter 5. The Castle. She never wanted. He bought 216 acres on Sands Point and built her an Irish castle, and she said she preferred Manhattan. The land had been purchased in 1901, before the marriage had even been agreed by the Gould family. Howard had begun planning a country house for himself, and had decided in the early planning stages that the house should be the centerpiece of the future marriage if Katherine ever consented. He had hired the architect Augustus N. Allen, then in the early stages of his Long Island career, and had instructed Allen to model the main building on Kilkenny Castle in Ireland, with crenellated towers, an inner courtyard, and a vast banqueting hall on the south front facing the Long Island Sound. Construction began in 1902 and finished in 1904. The total cost has been variously estimated at between $1 million and $1.5 million in 1900 money. The interiors were finished by Tiffany Studios in New York. The stable block, designed in the same crenellated stone, held places for 100 horses. The estate included formal gardens of 100 acres, an Italian terrace, a private bowling green, a billiard pavilion, a private rail spur that ran from the Long Island Railroad's Roslyn Station to the foot of the estate's drive, and a coastline of nearly a mile along the Sound. Castle Gould was finished in 1904. Howard and Katherine moved in for the summer season of 1905, 2 years before they would actually marry. The cohabitation in itself was a Gold Coast scandal, but in the small society of Sands Point and Glen Cove, it was tolerated because Howard had said publicly that the wedding was imminent. Katherine moved in. She walked the 100 acres of garden. She inspected the banqueting hall. She tried the bedrooms. By the end of the first week, she had told Howard that the castle was too large, too cold, too far from the city, and not at all what she had imagined when she had agreed to be a country wife. Howard's response is the kind of decision that makes biographers stop and reread the letter. He did not sell Castle Gould. He did not move back to Manhattan. He hired the architect Hunt and Hunt, sons of the great Richard Morris Hunt, who had built the William Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue, to design a second house on the same estate. The second house was Hempstead House, in the heavier Tudor style that Hunt and Hunt favored, with darker stone, smaller and more intimate rooms, a music room, a long gallery, and a more domestic feel. The cost of Hempstead House, completed in 1909, was a further $1.5 million. The total of the two builds and their furnishings is given by the Sands Point Preserve, which today holds the property at around $3 million in 1900 money, or roughly $110 million today. Katherine moved into Hempstead House when it opened. She found it more comfortable. She tolerated it for less than a year. By 1906, she was spending the summer in Newport at the cottage of friends rather than at her own estate. By the autumn, she had announced a trip to Europe. By the spring of 1907, she was on a Cunard liner bound for Liverpool, then on a train to Paris, then in residence at the Hotel Ritz in the Place Vendôme, alone. What was going wrong inside the marriage during those months is documented in the testimony of the 1907 separation case. Katherine alleged that Howard had taken to drinking heavily, mostly bourbon, often before the sun was down, and that his conversation in the evening had become coarse, accusatory, and occasionally violent. She alleged that on one occasion in the spring of 1906, he had locked her in a sitting room for several hours, ostensibly to keep her from leaving the house, and had only released her when the housekeeper intervened. Howard denied the locking. He alleged in his counter-testimony that Katherine had spent long afternoons in the company of a particular friend, William Frederick Cody, who had been touring with the Wild West in New York that spring and had been a house guest at Castle Gould on 2 occasions. Cody's friendship with the Goulds was real. He had been on social terms with Howard for almost 2 decades, since the marriage was first proposed and refused. He had played to standing audiences at Madison Square Garden in 1898, 1901, and 1905. He had visited Castle Gould in the summer seasons of 1904 and 1905. Whether his visits in those years were the friendship of an old protector to the woman he had brought to America 2 decades earlier, or whether they were something else, the testimony does not establish. Cody, called to give evidence in 1908, denied any improper relationship under oath. He was by then 61 years old, his health failing, and his Wild West losing money. He died in 1917. What is documented is that Katherine left in the spring of 1907. She did not return. She wrote to Howard from Paris in June of that year, setting out her intention to seek a legal separation. She named her lawyer in New York. She listed her financial expectations, including a roof over her head, a maintenance income, and the continued protection of her own name from anything Howard might say in court. Howard read the letter at Castle Gould. He sent for his own lawyer. The marriage of 9 years, the castles that had taken 5 years to build, and the family campaign of 16 years to obtain a respectable marriage for the quietest of the Gould sons all collapsed into a single envelope from Paris. The separation that followed would set an American record. It would be public, it would be ugly, and it would be expensive. It would also, in the long arc of the story, leave Katherine in comfort and Howard in retreat. 1888, the year they had met, was now 21 years in the past. Howard would live for another 52 years and would not marry again. The castles he had built would outlast him. The marriage would not. Chapter 6. The largest settlement of the era. In June 1907, Katherine Clemmons filed in the New York Supreme Court and asked for $36,000 a year. The figure was extraordinary. The largest known American separation settlement to that date had been the $20,000 a year awarded to the divorced wife of a Pittsburgh steel manufacturer in 1899. Katherine was asking for almost double. Her lawyers, Wicks and Wicks of Wall Street, justified the figure by reference to the marital lifestyle. Castle Gould had cost more than $1 million. Hempstead House had cost $1.5 million. The Park Avenue residence Howard maintained in the city ran a household of 14 servants. The wife of such an estate, the petition argued, could not be expected to maintain herself in any lesser style. Howard's lawyers were William D. Guthrie, by then one of the leading members of the New York Bar, and his partners. Guthrie filed a counter-petition. The counter-petition denied the merits of the separation, alleged adultery by Katherine with William Frederick Cody, and asked that any allowance be reduced to a token sum. The counter-petition cited specific dates on which Katherine had been seen in Cody's company at the Walbridge Hotel in Manhattan, at the railway station at Roslyn, and at a private box at the New York Hippodrome. The case opened in the New York Supreme Court in March 1908. It ran on the front pages of the city's papers for 6 weeks. The testimony was the most detailed public examination of a Gilded Age marriage that had yet been printed. Katherine, called to the stand on the second day, described the interior of Castle Gould, room by room, the staff by name, the daily routine, and the deterioration of Howard's drinking. She was cross-examined for 2.5 days. Howard, called to the stand a week later, denied the worst of her allegations, admitted he had drunk more than was wise during some periods of the marriage, and rejected the implication of physical violence. His cross-examination ran for 3 days. Cody was called on the 8th day. He arrived from a Wild West engagement in Pennsylvania, took the oath, and was led through his account of the visits to Castle Gould. He acknowledged the visits. He acknowledged the long friendship with both Katherine and Howard. He denied, under oath and in detail, any improper relationship with Katherine. The cross-examination by Guthrie ran for half a day. Cody held his account. The press divided. The Herald reported Cody's denials with sympathy. The World reported them with skepticism. The Sun printed both versions and let the reader judge. On May 20th, 1908, Justice Charles L. Guy delivered his judgment. He found that the marriage was beyond reconciliation. He found that Howard's drinking and his conduct in the spring of 1906 had constituted cruel and abusive treatment. He found that the adultery counter-petition had not been proved. He awarded Katherine a separation of bed and board under New York law, an allowance of $36,000 a year, custody of the Manhattan brownstone for as long as she lived alone, and the costs of the proceedings. The $36,000 was, the judgment noted, the largest sum yet awarded to a separated wife in the New York courts. The figure was equivalent to roughly $1.25 million a year in today's money. Howard was ordered to pay the first installment immediately. He did. He continued to pay it, with one short interruption during a 1912 appeal that failed until Katherine's death in 1937. A total of 29 years of payments, totaling just over $1 million at the original rate, in addition to the original legal fees of approximately $90,000. Howard's reaction in the years that followed was not financial collapse but social withdrawal. He sold Castle Gould in 1917 to Daniel Guggenheim, the copper magnate, for the modest sum of $175,000. The figure was less than 10% of the original build cost. Hempstead House and the estate passed with it. Guggenheim renamed the property Hempstead House and made it his principal country residence. After his death in 1930, the estate passed to his son Harry F. Guggenheim and to his daughter-in-law Alicia Patterson, the founder of Newsday. In 1971, the Guggenheim family donated the property to Nassau County. Today, it is the Sands Point Preserve, open to the public, and the two houses Howard built for Katherine stand intact. Visitors who tour Hempstead House walk through the music room where Katherine and Howard had quarreled in the spring of 1906. The piano is still there. Howard himself retired entirely from public life after the judgment. He kept a small apartment at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan and a cottage on the Connecticut shore. He maintained membership in the Knickerbocker Club and the Metropolitan but rarely attended. He did not remarry. He took an interest in the early aviation industry, invested modestly in 2 airlines in the 1920s, and gave small sums to charity through his sister Helen's foundations until her death in 1938. He outlived all his siblings except George, who died in 1923. He outlived Cody, who died in 1917. He outlived Katherine herself, who died in 1937 in a hotel suite in London at the age of 70. He died at his Manhattan apartment on the morning of September 4th, 1959, aged 87. His estate, still substantial, was divided among his sister Anna's surviving children and several charities. There were no children of his own. The Gould case is the second pattern in this documentary, and it differs from the Vanderbilt case in a single important way. There was no codicil. There was no rewritten will. The Gould family did not need to disinherit Howard because the trust structure George Gould had inherited from Jay. Gould was discretionary, and the social withdrawal of the rest of the family had begun the moment Howard had announced his marriage. The financial cost to Howard was the construction of the castles, the legal fees of the separation, and the 29 years of payments to Katherine. It was a substantial cost. It did not bankrupt him. What it took from him instead was time. 16 years of waiting before the marriage, 9 years of unhappy living within it, 52 years of withdrawal afterward. The bill was paid in years, not in dollars. The instrument was the same as in the Vanderbilt case, only the means of payment differed. The third man in this story would pay in a third currency. He would not pay in money, of which he had too much to be reduced, and he would not pay in years of withdrawal because he refused to withdraw. He would pay in the slow draining of an entire institution, the New York Herald itself, and in 40 years of exile from a city he could have run from his desk if he had only stayed. Chapter 7. The Editor Who Owned New York. By the autumn of 1876, James Gordon Bennett II had funded the search for Livingstone, financed the Jeannette Polar expedition, and announced his engagement to a Knickerbocker. The Herald in that year was the largest daily paper in the United States, with a circulation of around 160,000 copies and a paid weekly readership well over 1 million. The paper had been founded by Bennett's father, James Gordon Bennett the Elder, in 1835 with $500 of borrowed capital. The elder Bennett had died in 1872, leaving the paper, the building, the printing presses, and a personal estate of approximately $16 million, all of it to his only surviving son. The son was 35 in 1876. He had been raised by a doting father and a frosty Catholic mother, much of it on ocean liners and at continental hotels, with extended stays in Paris, Versailles, Rome, and Newport. He had been educated by private tutors. He had served briefly in the United States Revenue Marine during the Civil War, commanding the steam yacht Henrietta on coastal patrol. He had inherited the Herald at 31 in 1872 and had immediately set about extending its reach and its scandals with equal energy. The Stanley and Livingstone story belongs to this period. In 1869, 3 years before he inherited the paper, Bennett the Younger had summoned the journalist Henry Morton Stanley to a hotel suite in Paris and told him, in a single famous instruction, to find David Livingstone in Central Africa. Stanley had received an open checkbook and instructions to spend whatever was necessary. The expedition took 2 years, cost approximately £20,000 sterling, and ended at Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika in November 1871 with the greeting, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." The dispatches Stanley sent home, printed in the Herald in 1872 and 1873, were the journalistic sensation of the decade. Bennett followed Stanley with further investments in spectacle journalism. He funded the disastrous Jeannette Polar expedition in 1879, which would lose its captain George W. DeLong and most of its crew in the Siberian ice. He underwrote the International Polo Cup. He founded the Bennett trophies in yacht racing, in motoring, in ballooning, and after 1906 in aeroplane racing. He paid for transatlantic cable extensions to bring European news to New York, hours faster than his rivals. He hired correspondents in capitals across Europe, Africa, and Asia at salaries that no competitor could match. He had, by 1876, made the Herald a global paper from a single New York building on Broadway and Ann Street. The personal life that ran alongside the journalism was already eccentric. Bennett kept a steam yacht, the Polinia, on which he lived for long stretches at sea. He owned racehorses. He maintained a household of personal servants beyond the scale even of the Vanderbilts. He drank heavily, sometimes for days at a stretch, and was known to disappear from the Herald offices for weeks. He was also, in his sober hours, a sharp and decisive editor. The Herald in the early 1870s was unmistakably his paper. The leaders were his. The sensational coverage was his. The scoops were his. In the summer of 1876, at the height of all this, Bennett announced his engagement to Caroline May. She was the daughter of Dr. William May, a respected Knickerbocker physician of old New York stock, and the niece of the late Charles A. May, who had served in Congress. The May family was not Vanderbilt rich. It was not Astor rich. It was something rarer and in some ways more valuable. An old New York family with an unbroken social pedigree going back to the 1790s and no scandal in any branch. For Bennett to marry into the May family was for him to settle, to ratify his position, to accept the respectability that the Herald's gossip pages had so often denied to lesser men. The engagement was announced in October. The wedding date was set for the spring of 1877. The May house at 12 East 9th Street was prepared for the engagement parties of the autumn and winter season. Bennett was invited to every May family dinner. His mother-in-law-to-be, Mrs. William May, made a particular effort to include him in family conversation. His sister-in-law-to-be, Caroline's younger sister Mary, brought him into the small society of Washington Square. Caroline herself, 27 years old and reckoned by the columns to be the most beautiful debutante of her late season, was photographed with Bennett in a Brady studio that November. The photograph survives. They sit together on a velvet bench. Bennett's hand rests on the back of the bench, just behind her shoulder. His face is serious. Hers is composed. Neither looks at the camera. The picture is the engagement of a Knickerbocker and a press lord at the peak of the press lord's career. What was less visible to the columns was the deteriorating relationship between Bennett and his mother. Bennett the elder had died in 1872. Mrs. Bennett, Henrietta Crean, who had separated from her husband long before his death and had lived in Paris for decades, had returned to America briefly in the early 1870s and then settled in Versailles permanently. Bennett had become accustomed in his 1870s to seeing his mother as a fixed point of European life, rather than as an active part of his own. The May engagement was, in part, his attempt to construct a New York family of his own from nothing, with a respectable in-law and a young wife of his own choosing. He invited Caroline May and her parents to call at his Fifth Avenue house on the afternoon of New Year's Day, 1877. He had ordered a small private dinner for the family that evening. He had arranged for flowers. He had selected a ring. The engagement, the columns assumed, was on schedule. The wedding plans for the spring were proceeding. Bennett II was about to become, after years of solo bachelorhood, a married man. What none of them yet knew was that on the morning of January 1st, 1877, Bennett would attend a long luncheon at the Union Club, would drink considerably more than he had intended, and would arrive at the May House in a condition that the next 40 years of his life would not undo. Chapter 8. The Drunken Hour. At the Fireplace. He arrived at 4 in the afternoon with a long luncheon already behind him, and he did not leave the way a fiancée leaves. The luncheon had been at the Union Club on Fifth Avenue. It had begun at 1. It had included a private room, a small party of male friends, and a quantity of champagne and brandy that survives in 2 separate accounts in the diaries of those present. Bennett was 35, 6 feet tall, of vigorous health, and accustomed to substantial drinking, but by 4 in the afternoon, he was, in the words of one of his Union Club companions, writing privately to a friend a week later, beyond himself. He walked from the Union Club at 5th Avenue and 21st Street to the May House at 12 East 9th Street, a distance of about 3/4 of a mile, in the cold January wind. He arrived at the May House at approximately 4:15. He was admitted by the butler. He was shown to the parlor on the ground floor. The parlor, by the standards of the day, was a substantial room with a marble mantelpiece, a coal fire burning in the grate, 2 long sofas, a piano, and a window onto 9th Street. Caroline May was in the parlor. So were her father, Dr. William May, her mother, her younger sister Mary, her brother Frederick, and 4 or 5 family friends who had been invited for the New Year's afternoon. The party was small and informal. Drinks had been served. Conversation was general. Bennett was greeted, was offered a chair, was offered a drink, and was, by his own later admission, and by the testimony of every witness, already very drunk. What he did then has been described in 3 or 4 different versions. The most widely repeated version, the one that became the New York legend, says that he stood up after a few minutes, walked to the fireplace, unbuttoned his trousers, and urinated into the burning coals. A second version, attested by one of the family friends present in a letter written some years later, says that he urinated into the grand piano rather than into the fireplace. A third version, attested by a Union Club companion to whom Bennett confided his memory of the afternoon a few weeks later, says that he attempted both and accomplished only one. The differences do not matter. The substance is the same. Bennett, in front of his fiancée, her parents, her younger sister, her brother, and the family friends, urinated in the front parlor of the May House. There was a moment of silence. Mrs. May, by the same letter from the family friend, walked out of the room without a word. Caroline May remained where she was, in her chair near the piano, white in the face. Dr. May took Bennett by the elbow and walked him to the front door. The footman fetched his coat. He was put out onto 9th Street, and the door closed behind him. That night, Caroline May returned the ring. Bennett wrote her a letter of apology, by his own admission half drunk, half ashamed, half defiant, and had it delivered the next morning. The letter was returned unopened. The engagement was broken. 2 days later, on January 3rd, Bennett walked up the steps of the Union Club at the start of the evening. Frederick May, Caroline's elder brother, was waiting for him on the pavement. Frederick May was 27, an athletic young man who had served briefly in the United States Navy. He carried a riding whip. He stepped forward as Bennett approached and struck him 3 times across the face and shoulders with the whip in full view of pedestrians on 5th Avenue. He then turned and walked away. The horsewhipping had its desired effect. The story was around the city by the next morning. The papers, including Bennett's own Herald, refused to print it directly. The Sun and the Tribune ran items that were transparent in their indirection. Every reader of every paper in the city understood what had happened. A duel followed. The challenge was issued by Frederick May to Bennett through the conventional intermediaries on January 4th. The location agreed was Slaughter's Gap, just over the Maryland state line, where dueling was still tolerated by indifferent local authorities. The day was January 7th. The seconds were Daniel Butterfield for Bennett and Hugh Bagatelle for May. The weapons were dueling pistols at 12 paces. Both men fired. Both men missed. Deliberately or accidentally is not recorded. Bennett's bullet struck the ground a foot to May's right. May's bullet struck a tree behind Bennett's shoulder. Honor was satisfied. The seconds bowed. The party returned to Washington and then to New York. Bennett did not return to New York for long. Within 10 days, he had packed 3 trunks at the Fifth Avenue house, had instructed his managing editor at the Herald to run the paper by cable to Paris until further notice, had transferred a substantial deposit to a Paris bank, and had boarded the French line steamer La Bretagne at the foot of West 14th Street, bound for Le Havre. He landed at Le Havre on January 23, 1877. He took the train to Paris. He walked from the Gare Saint-Lazare to the Hotel Bristol. He took rooms there for a fortnight and then leased an apartment at Avenue d'Eylau in the 8th arrondissement. He did not return permanently to the United States for the remaining 41 years of his life. He made occasional brief visits by his own count 3, the longest of which was 6 weeks in 1884. The Avenue d'Eylau apartment became the center of his life. The yacht Namuna became its mobile annex. The Mediterranean became his theater. The Herald, the central asset of the Bennett fortune. The dynastic flagship his father had founded with $500 of borrowed capital, was to be run from a writing desk in Paris by cable to New York for the rest of its independent existence. The fireplace at 12 East 9th Street still stands. The May House was demolished in 1930. The marble mantelpiece was removed by the demolition contractor and was, after several intermediate owners, sold at auction at Christie's in 1971 to a Manhattan collector who installed it in a Park Avenue apartment where it remains. The fire that Bennett put out by his single act of January 1st, 1877, would smolder in his life and in the life of his newspaper for the next 41 years. Chapter 9. 40 Years of Yachts and Cables. He spent the next 4 decades running the largest newspaper in America by cable from a deck chair in the Mediterranean. The Avenue d'Eylau apartment, his official Paris address, was a vast set of rooms on the second floor of a Haussmann building near the Trocadero. He kept 12 servants there permanently. He kept 4 cooks. He kept 2 valets. He kept a personal telegraph clerk who took shifts at the cable office to receive the morning dispatches from New York and to transmit Bennett's editorial instructions back. The instructions were sometimes precise, sometimes whimsical. He once cabled the Herald managing editor in New York with a single word, Bible, and waited for the editor to work out that he meant a particular biblical text be printed verbatim on the leader page. The editor worked it out. The text was printed. The yacht Namuna had been built in 1882 at Cramp's Shipyard in Philadelphia at a cost of $225,000, then a record for an American private yacht. She was 227 feet long, displaced 1,010 tons, and carried steam machinery for transatlantic crossing, as well as full sail for fair weather. Bennett lived aboard her for as much of the year as the weather permitted. She wintered on the Riviera, summered in the North Sea, made occasional crossings to New York Harbor during the visits he reluctantly paid to the Home Office. He sold the Namuna in 1903 and commissioned a successor, the Lysistrata, from the British shipbuilder Hawthorne Leslie at a cost of $600,000. The Lysistrata was 285 feet long, displaced 2,000 tons, and contained, among her many private features, a small cow pen on the upper deck, so that the proprietor could have fresh milk at sea regardless of the length of the cruise. The annual cost of Bennett's personal life through these decades, as reconstructed by his executors after his death in 1918, ran at approximately $1 million a year. The figure is in 1900 money. Adjusted to today, it is the equivalent of around $35 million annually. Over 40 years, the total of personal spending was therefore around 40 million in 1900 terms, or somewhat over $1 billion in today's money. The figure includes the yachts, the Paris apartment, the leases at Beaulieu-sur-Mer on the Riviera, the racehorses, the motor cars, the salaries of personal staff, the mistresses, the gifts, and the catastrophic gambling losses that occasionally featured in his Monte Carlo seasons. It does not include the operating costs of the Herald. The Herald itself, by the late 1880s, was beginning to slip. Joseph Pulitzer had bought the New York World in 1883 and had turned it into a sensational paper that was eating into the Herald's circulation. William Randolph Hearst had bought the New York Journal in 1895 and was eating into both. Both Pulitzer and Hearst were in New York, supervising the news cycles in person, hiring and firing editors from the lobby, walking the composing room at midnight to make changes on the front page. Bennett was in Paris. His editor in New York, Don Carlos Seitz, was competent but limited by the fact that any major decision had to be cabled to Paris and a reply awaited. The slow decline of the Herald's market share over the 1890s and 1900s was therefore not the result of bad journalism, but of absentee ownership. By 1900, the Herald's New York daily circulation had fallen behind both the World and the Journal. By 1910, it was behind the Times as well. Bennett's defensive innovations from Paris, the Sunday magazine, the lavish illustrated supplements, the International News Network kept the paper alive. They did not restore its lead. In Paris itself, Bennett did one substantial thing of lasting value. In October 1887, he founded the European edition of the Herald, the New York Herald Paris edition, in a small building on the Avenue de l'Opéra. The Paris Herald was designed for American expatriates and English-speaking travelers, and was the first American newspaper printed permanently abroad. It was an immediate success. By 1900, it had a circulation of around 12,000 copies, mostly in Paris and the major European capitals. By 1910, it had become one of the institutions of American Paris. It would survive Bennett, would pass through several owners in the 20th century, and would eventually merge with the New York Times International edition. It is the single Bennett venture of the Paris years that has unambiguously outlived him. Bennett married in 1914, at the age of 73. The bride was Maud Potter, the widow of George de Ruyter of the Ruyter Telegraph family, and the former wife of George Stephenson Potter. She was substantially younger than Bennett, but no longer young herself. The wedding took place quietly in Paris. There were no children. The marriage was, by all accounts, calm and affectionate. It came 37 years after the broken engagement to Caroline May. It seemed to settle Bennett in his last years, to bring him the kind of domestic life he had not had since his mother left his father in the 1860s. The First World War complicated the Paris years. The Herald in New York supported American neutrality through 1914 and 1915, then pivoted to interventionism after the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915 and the German submarine campaign of 1916. The Paris Herald, naturally closer to the war, ran a more pro-Allied editorial line from the start. Bennett, by then in his mid-70s, oversaw both lines by cable and by daily visits to the Paris Herald offices. He was photographed in 1916 at his Paris desk, bearded, stout, intent, surrounded by stacks of cables. He died at his villa in Beaulieu-sur-Mer on May 14, 1918, of a heart attack, age 77. His estate was estimated at $4 to $6 million, including the New York Herald, the Paris Herald, the Avenue des Lau apartment, the villa at Beaulieu, the yacht Lysistrata, and the residual assets. The estate had been $16 million in 1872 when his father died. Adjusted for inflation between 1872 and 1918, the destruction of capital was substantially more than the headline number suggested. Maud Bennett, the widow, lived until 1946. The New York Herald itself was sold in 1920 by Bennett's executors to Frank Munsey for around $4 million. Munsey, a notoriously cold consolidator of papers, ran it for 4 years and then folded it into the New York Tribune in 1924 to form the New York Herald Tribune. The Herald Tribune itself ran until 1966. The Paris Herald continued under various owners and is the lineal ancestor of the present-day International New York Times. The Bennett dynasty, the family that had owned the most influential newspaper in 19th century America, had ceased to exist as a force in New York life by 1924. The 40-year exile that had begun with a drunken hour at a fireplace had ended with the sale of the family business. The single act of January 1st, 1877 had cost Bennett a fiancee, a city, and ultimately the paper itself. The instrument was not a will, it was not a trust. It was the slow drain of an institution that requires daily attention from a proprietor who was permanently somewhere else. The 3 cases of this documentary are now complete. What remains is to look at them together and to ask what the architecture was that destroyed all 3. Chapter 10. The Will, the Trust. The Calling Card. In each of 3 cases, the same instrument did the cutting, and the woman in the story was rarely the one who held it. The instrument in the Vanderbilt case was a will. The instrument in the Gould case was a court-ordered separation, supported by a family trust, that had been engineered to make withdrawal of social and financial support easy. The instrument in the Bennett case was, in formal terms, none of the above. Bennett kept his fortune for life. His instrument was self-imposed. The 40-year exile he chose for himself drained the family asset more thoroughly than any will could have done. The legal architecture of Gilded Age inheritance is the first piece. American property law of the 1890s had abolished the English principle of entail, the doctrine that bound landed property to a single line of succession for generations. The last entails in American states had fallen by the 1830s. From that point onward, an American testator could write his will exactly as he wished. He could leave everything to one child and nothing to another. He could attach conditions, marriage clauses, residence clauses, behavior clauses, religion clauses. He could rewrite the will at any time before death. The only limit was the spousal dower right, which guaranteed a widow a fixed portion of the estate. The eldest son had no protection at all. This was an extraordinary degree of discretionary power. In the European systems from which most American property law had descended, the eldest son had legal protections against arbitrary disinheritance. In England, the rule of primogeniture had been softened, but not abolished in landed estates. In France, the Napoleonic Code required a strict equal division between children. In Germany, the various civil codes had similar protections. In America, none of this applied. A Vanderbilt father in 1899 could leave his eldest son out, and the will would stand. Cornelius Vanderbilt II did exactly that. The Court of Probate in New York County certified the will in October 1899. The case was closed. The eldest son had no legal recourse. The second piece of the architecture was the discretionary trust. The Gould fortune had been held under a family trust since Jay Gould's death in 1892. The trustees were George Gould as senior trustee and the family lawyer Sterling, Drake, and Sterling. The trust deed gave the trustees discretion over distributions to beneficiaries. In practice, this meant that George Gould could increase or reduce the income paid to any of his siblings, according to his judgment of their conduct. Howard Gould's $12 million inheritance was nominally his. The income on it, however, came through the trust. After the 1907 separation and the 1908 judgment, the trust income to Howard was steady but never increased. The capital invested in Castle Gould was Howard's outright. Everything else, including the discretionary distributions that might have funded a second life, was George's to give or withhold. The third piece was the New York separation law. From 1879 through 1967, the only ground for absolute divorce in New York State was adultery, proved to the satisfaction of the court. Lesser conduct could justify a separation of bed and board, which permitted maintenance but did not permit remarriage. The Gould case was a separation. Katherine could not remarry. Howard could not remarry. The form of the proceedings was conservative. The consequences were not. The fourth piece was the unwritten code of the patriarch's balls and the social register. Caroline Schermerhorn. Astor's list of 400 names had governed New York invitations from the 1870s. The social register, first published in 1886 by Lewis Keller, codified the list and extended it. The Patriarch's Balls, organized by Ward McAllister, brought the 400 into a single ballroom each season. To be cut from the list was to be effectively cut from the city. Cornelius Vanderbilt III was not cut. His marriage to Grace Wilson was an internal Vanderbilt family quarrel, not a society quarrel, and Grace was eventually folded back into the 400. Howard Gould was not cut either. He simply withdrew. Bennett, the third case, was cut, immediately and unambiguously. The horsewhipping at the Union Club ended his social life in New York within 72 hours. Town topics under Colonel William D. Alton Mann from 1890 provided the punitive dimension that the social register alone could not. Mann's Gossip Weekly kept files of unprinted scandal on every prominent family in New York. The unprinted files were the leverage Mann used to extract payments in exchange for omitted paragraphs. In the case of the Vanderbilt will of 1899, Mann ran the inheritance story with sympathy to Grace and Cornelius III, possibly because the elder Vanderbilts had refused his payment requests. In the Gould case, Mann's coverage of the separation was sympathetic to neither party. In the Bennett case, Mann printed almost nothing, possibly because Bennett's own absence from New York and the absence of his daily presence at clubs and dinners made him an unprofitable target. Together, the four pieces formed an architecture. The will gave the patriarch a weapon. The trust gave the trustees a continuous weapon. The marriage and separation law gave the courts a procedural framework that took years to traverse. The social register and town topics gave the city a means of public punishment that did not depend on courts. The four pieces operated together. They were the structure that punished Cornelius Vanderbilt III for marrying Grace Wilson, that punished Howard Gould for marrying Katherine Clemmons, and that punished James Gordon Bennett II for the drunken hour at the fireplace. The woman in each case was the pretext. The architecture was the actual weapon. Chapter 11. The Register and the Empty Pew. The court could only take the money, but the 400 could take the city. In each of the three cases, the financial penalty was severe, and the social penalty was more severe still. The three social outcomes, looked at together, reveal as much about the New York of the period as they do about the three men. Grace Wilson Vanderbilt's social outcome was, against every prediction printed in 1896, a victory. The empty Vanderbilt pew at St. Mark's Church became, within 15 years, the irrelevant footnote of an outdated quarrel. Grace's strategy was patient. She did not press for early acceptance. She allowed the Vanderbilt family network to remain at a distance through the late 1890s and the early 1900s. She concentrated instead on building her own circle. She entertained on a careful but ambitious scale at the 647 Fifth Avenue house. She cultivated her relationships with the Boldini sitters of the era, with the Worth dressmakers in Paris, with the European royalty who visited New York. By 1910, she had become a recognized hostess. By 1920, she was widely described as the queen of society in the New York columns. Her dinners for the Prince of Wales in 1924, for the King and Queen of Belgium in 1919, and for visiting British and French royalty through the 1920s, placed her firmly in the front rank of New York hostesses. The Vanderbilt elders who had refused her in 1896 were dead by then. The 400 itself had ceased to operate as a list by the First World War. Grace had won by outlasting both the people who had refused her and the apparatus they had used to refuse her. Howard Gould's social outcome was a self-chosen withdrawal. He was not cut by the 400. He was not crossed off any list. He simply stopped attending. The Knickerbocker and the Metropolitan retained his name on their membership rolls. He paid his dues. He almost never appeared. His name continued to appear in the social register every year until his death in 1959, although the listing eventually became simply Howard Gould, Bachelor, Plaza Hotel. The social outcome was not exclusion. It was self-exile. The Gould family, the dynasty Jay Gould had built and George Gould had managed, continued in public life through the 1920s and 30s. Anna remained a presence in Paris and Newport. Helen ran her charitable foundations. Edwin pursued his banking. Howard alone disappeared. The social register listed him for 52 years after the separation. The city forgot him within 10. James Gordon Bennett. The second social outcome was the most dramatic and the most permanent. The horsewhipping on the steps of the Union Club on January 3, 1877, was the unambiguous public ratification of his exclusion. His name was removed from the patriarch's ball list immediately and was never restored. The social register listed him through 1894 and then stopped. The Union Club itself, where the horsewhipping had taken place, kept his name on its rolls for a decade as a formality, but never invited him to its events. By the 1900s, the Bennett name in New York was associated with absence rather than presence. His occasional visits in 1884 and the early 1890s were noted in the press as visits, never as returns. He maintained the Fifth Avenue house through the 1880s and let it pass to a real estate syndicate in 1890. After that, he had no permanent New York address. What made the Bennett exclusion permanent was the geography of his self-exile. Cornelius Vanderbilt III had stayed in New York, had raised his children there, had served at the New York Central, had built his career and his social position from inside the city he had been ostracized within. Howard Gould had stayed in New York. He had simply withdrawn within it. Bennett had left. The 40-year Paris exile made it impossible for any social rehabilitation to take place. The 400 had no mechanism for restoring a man who lived in Avenue Daylo. The patriarch's balls could not invite a man who would not come. The social register could not list a man with no New York address. The exclusion was not so much a punishment as a vacuum. Bennett had walked out of the room. He never walked back in. The three social outcomes therefore form a kind of spectrum. Grace Wilson Vanderbilt won the war within the city by patience and competence. Howard Gould lost the war within the city by withdrawal. James Gordon Bennett II lost the war by leaving the field. The court verdict in each case was the dollar penalty. The social verdict in each case was the city itself. New York is the third party in all three stories. The court could only take the money. The 400 could take the city. Two of the three lost the city. One regained it. The wife in each case had nothing to do with which of the three outcomes was reached. The architecture decided that. The architecture had a procedure for fighting back. The slow, patient social campaign of a determined hostess like Grace Wilson. The architecture had a procedure for surrendering. The quiet withdrawal of a Howard Gould. The architecture had a procedure for absent abandonment. The 40-year Paris exile of a James Gordon Bennett II. Each procedure had its known cost. Each procedure had its known outcome. The wives, by the end of all three stories, had outlived the architecture itself. Chapter 12. The script you still inherit. Today. A century later, the wills are softer, the columns are gone, the 400 is a museum exhibit, and the script is still being written. The legal landscape that allowed Cornelius Vanderbilt II to disinherit his eldest son in a single codicil has been moderated in most American states by family provision statutes that protect spouses and minor children. The 400 no longer meets. The patriarch's balls ended with the First World War. Town Topics ceased publication in 1937. The social register continues to appear, but has long since become a private genealogical record rather than a public arbiter of access. Most of the visible apparatus of Gilded Age control has dissolved. The dissolution is partial. The unilateral will still permits an American testator to leave most of his fortune to one child rather than another. The discretionary family trust, the instrument that controlled Howard Gould's distributions through George Gould's trusteeship, has become, if anything, more sophisticated rather than less. The Dynasty Trust and the Perpetual Trust permit a settler to extend control over distributions to children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, sometimes in perpetuity. The marriage clause has not disappeared. It has been rewritten as the lifestyle clause, the residence clause, the religion clause, the substance clause. The discretionary trustee, whether a private trust company in Delaware or a family member elsewhere, retains the power to give or withhold income on the basis of the beneficiary's conduct. The contemporary mechanism of social control is less visible than its Gilded Age counterpart, but it has not vanished. The family office, the institution that emerged in the late 20th century to manage substantial inherited fortunes, retains many of the functions that the family lawyer once performed. The prenuptial agreement, almost unknown in 1896, is now standard practice in wealthy families, and frequently includes provisions designed to discourage divorce or to penalize the beneficiary in case of separation. The private bank retains the function of the discretionary trustee, taking instructions from the senior generation and applying judgment to the requests of the junior. The conditions attached to substantial gifts in life, often labeled financial wellness, counseling, or family governance, perform a softened version of the disciplinary function that the Gilded Age will perform in death. What the three case studies of this documentary therefore reveal is not that the architecture has been dismantled, but that it has been remodeled. The mechanism has been made less visible. The principle has been preserved. To inherit substantial wealth in 2026 is still to inherit a script. The script today is softer in language than the codicil Cornelius Vanderbilt II, signed in July 1896. It is gentler in its public face than the empty pew at St. Mark's Church. It is more legally constrained than the discretionary trust that George Gould controlled. The script is still there. The script still has authors who are not the heir. The script still has clauses that penalize the heir who steps outside it. The three men of this story stepped outside their scripts. Cornelius Vanderbilt III stepped outside by marrying Grace Wilson against his father's explicit refusal. Howard Gould stepped outside by waiting 16 years, and then marrying Katherine Clemmons against his family's preference. James Gordon Bennett II stepped outside not by a marriage, but by a single act of public disgrace, which broke an engagement that had been intended to settle him. Each man believed that the decision was his to make. Each man discovered that the decision belonged in part to a wider structure that had been built around the fortune long before he had been born. The cost in each case was substantial. Cornelius Vanderbilt III lost approximately $40 million in 1899 money, the difference between the share his father had originally intended and the share the rewritten will actually delivered. He kept his marriage, his career, his children, and his health. He died at 69 in his own bed. Howard Gould lost approximately $5 million across the construction of the castles, the legal fees, and the 29 years of separation payments. He kept his money, but he lost his time. 52 years of withdrawal followed. He died at 87 in a Manhattan hotel room, with no one of his own remaining to mourn him. James Gordon Bennett II lost the operating control of the New York Herald, which his father had built from $500 of borrowed capital in 1835, and which his own absent ownership for 40 years allowed Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst to overtake. The paper itself was sold by his executors in 1920 and disappeared as a separate masthead in 1924. The three wives outlived the architecture, and in two of the three cases, outlived the men. Grace Wilson Vanderbilt lived from 1870 to 1953, ran New York society for 2 decades, and saw the empty Vanderbilt pew of 1896 become a forgotten footnote. Katherine Clemmons Gould lived from 1867 to 1937, spent 29 comfortable years on the separation income from Howard, and was photographed in London and Paris into her late 60s. Caroline May, the broken fiancée of January 1st, 1877, never married, lived quietly with her family in New York and died in 1916 at 67. Of the three women, only Caroline May was ultimately broken by the events of the story, and her break was the silent one. The other two won in their respective ways the long game. The question the documentary leaves with the viewer is simple and unwelcome. If the same fortune were placed before you tomorrow with the same conditions attached, what would you do? If your father told you in a quiet upstairs library that the woman you loved was not acceptable, that to marry her would cost you $40 million, that the codicil was already drafted and waiting in the equitable trust safe, would you marry her? If your family had warned you for 16 years against an actress and you were 36 and tired of waiting, would you build her a castle? If you arrived very drunk at your fiancé's parlor on a New Year's afternoon, would you have left the parlor the way the family expected? Or would you have done what Bennett did? The three men in this story made the choices they made. The fortunes around them responded the way fortunes do. The wives, with one quiet exception, lived on. A century later, the architecture is softer in its language and more discreet in its public face. The clauses are still there. The trustees are still there. The private bank is still there. The prenuptial agreement and the discretionary trust have replaced the codicil and the patriarch's ball list. The script is still written by someone else. To love outside the script is still to risk being written out of it. The three men of this story discovered that fact across 40 years and on 3 different continents. The viewer who has stayed with their stories to the end is invited to consider the same question they faced in private, with no audience, in the quiet that follows the moment the parents have left the room. The wills are softer now. The structure is the same. The script is still being written. The only open question is who writes the part you are in. If you have stayed with me to the end of this story, subscribe so the next one finds you. Old Money Corrupts publishes the wills, the trusts, and the empty pews the family histories try to forget. Tell me in the comments which of these three men you would have been, Cornelius III, Howard, or Bennett, and which of the three women you think paid the highest price in the end.